Hey folks, welcome back and on to a discussion of political culture.
And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We'll define political culture, civic culture, identity politics, and political trust. We'll contrast democratic political culture with authoritarian political culture. We'll discuss postmaterialism to illustrate how political cultures change. And we'll analyze the theory of inherent conflict between civilizations.
Hopefully, from our readings and discussions so far, you're beginning to realize there's certain ingredients that are quite helpful to democracy. And I know we discussed this in our chapter that focused on democracy. We tend to see some similarities in established democracies around the world. One is that we tend to see a large middle class, so these are countries that are wealthy overall. They have a large national wealth, but that wealth is not concentrated just into a few hands. There's a large middle class. We tend to see high levels of overall education and literacy. It's very difficult to be an informed participant in a democracy if you have low levels of education or are illiterate. Um, but there's something a little bit more nebulous here. There's something a little bit more mysterious. We're going to talk about it this week. A key aspect of a successful democracy is a healthy political culture. And political culture is interesting to study in a comparative way. In fact, it's necessary to study in a comparative way and to see how political cultures vary across the world. So, just to drill down this concept, political culture is the beliefs, opinions, emotions of individual citizens toward their government and fellow citizens. They're those similarities that people have, perhaps as a Minnesotan or an American or a Russian or somebody who is Japanese. What are those shared political beliefs that compose the culture around politics? So, some examples might be Americans are usually more skeptical relative to people elsewhere of leaders having too much power and authority being too centralized. And that makes sense considering our political history. Um, some countries like Japan are much more collectivist, where uh, the Japanese see themselves more as a collective whole as opposed to individuals. Um, And because we absorb our political culture from our parents, from our families, political culture is tends to be stable. It's slow to change. And so there are aspects of American political culture that were there from the early days of the Republic or even the colonial period that we still see today. Some textbook definitions. I already explained what political culture is, but your textbook describes it as the sum of individual values and norms regarding politics and the political system or the culture of a group, giving meaning to political action. We'll discuss that. And then how does that political culture break down? There's elite political culture held by those who are closest to power at the highest level of power, business leaders, bureaucrats, elected officials, could be intellectual leaders and others. Another important term to understand for this reading, but also to kind of understand what's happening in American politics and politics elsewhere, is the rise of identity politics, where more and more political positions and activities are based on associations with a particular identity. That could be being a white male, it could be being a woman and a feminist, it could be seeing yourself as a senior citizen or a retiree or a millennial. It could be ethnicity, religion, um, disability, sexual orientation, or LGBTQ status. Um, More and more, we are breaking down into these identities, and some people use this as a negative term that identity politics are necessarily a bad thing. But just about everybody more and more is associating themselves with a particular subgroup. Okay, what's an ideal for political culture? Allman and Verba conducted the first social scientific study of political culture in 1963 called the civic culture, and they coined this term, and they were focused on the United States, which exhibit many of these characteristics that they said were ideal when it came to a healthy political culture. It's an environment where citizens are sufficiently active in politics to express their preferences to leaders, but not so involved that they refuse to comply with policies and laws. So you want citizens that vote and write letters to the editor and engage in political discussion, peaceful, respectful political discussion, peaceful voting, nonviolent demonstrations. These would be examples of sufficient participation. But what you don't want is people seeing a leader elected that they don't like and rising up against their government violently or refusing to comply with rules and laws that they don't agree with. So that would be too much involvement. That would be too much action. So you want citizen participation, but in established ways and not too much. And of course, in our contemporary politics, it can be difficult to find, what are the traditional ways to participate and what are the less traditional, that those lines are blurring somewhat. But this gives you an idea that um, more political participation isn't always necessarily helpful. Sometimes it can be destabilizing. So it's sort of that right amount. That's that not too hot, not too cold engagement, but not riotous, violent political engagement. So I explored civic culture already. Another important concept to understand is the rise of post-materialism and how this has impacted our political culture, both in the United States and in many other Western democracies. We saw coming out of World War II and the generation that was born out of World War II, they were raised in a period in Western Europe and the United States of great prosperity relative to their parents and grandparents. They grew up in relative safety. They grew up with much higher levels of prosperity, and this made them less materialistic in their views. That is, it wasn't basically about providing material needs to their family, securing food, securing shelter. People could start to decide, hey, I want to go to college and I want to study art history and maybe become a professor of art history. Um, and not necessarily say, well, I'm going to go work at the factory down the street because that's the only job that's available and I need to meet the basic needs of my family. And so that's this concept of post materialism, being able to emphasize quality of life issues and decisions in your life over just basic physical security and feeding yourself and your family. Anybody who's taken a psychology class may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. You've got your basic needs at the base of this pyramid, right? Physiological needs and safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then self actualization. So you see, as you're able to meet some more of those basic needs, you can focus more of your time on esteem and self actualization. This is very much in tune with the concept of post materialism. So if we were in class right now, it'd be interesting to say, okay, what is your primary motivation when you're finding a job? Is it just the security of the job? Is it the pay of the job? Is it just putting food on the table for your family? And I would guess relative to 50 years ago, 60 years ago in the United States, more of you in the classroom would say, I want to find a job that I care about. I want to be doing work that I feel is important and it's helpful to society. And yes, certainly I gotta pay the bills, and that remains a factor. But I care. I want to find something that I'm passionate and interested in. That's probably not what you would find if you were asking people in the 1930s or 1940s about what their career prospects were going to be. They're probably going to say, "Hey, I need to meet my financial responsibility to provide basic security and shelter and food for my family," and that's a much different discussion. One of the big challenges that we face in the United States and around the world has been a decline of political trust. And we've seen this particularly in the United States and Western Europe and places like the United Kingdom and elsewhere, which is that people are less trusting in their political leaders than they were in the past and no longer believe that they're well intentioned and effective in serving the interest of the governed. And that's a big problem because you're probably not going to invest your resources, your tax dollars. You're probably not going to contribute to the same degree if you see your leaders as fundamentally corrupt or fundamentally ineffective in carrying out their responsibility. Political trust in the United States used to be pretty high coming out of World War II and the response to the Great Depression. But as we got into the late 1960s, the United States involvement in the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, this led a lot of people to question their government. And in both situations, there were illustrations that their government was lying to them about the success and possibilities in democratizing Vietnam, lying about the political scandals under Richard Nixon. And the United States hasn't fully recovered from that. Other countries have had similar experiences, but we're just seeing around the world more people skeptical of their governing institutions, and that makes it really hard to get things done. So, how do we reverse this? This gets into the concept of social capital. How do you build a culture of trust and cooperation to make doing things possible? This also gets into the term collective action. So, many problems we face in political science or the study of politics is overcoming collective action dilemmas. It may be in your interest to not participate in the collective because you could maybe benefit from whatever the collective does, but then keep your resources to yourself. You might have a short term benefit of cheating on your taxes, knowing that you could still enjoy the safety and security and the parks and the school system and so forth, even if you don't pay your fair share of taxes. This gets into the idea of a collective action dilemma when people can benefit from what's happening in the collective but not contribute. And if you're not trusting in your political leaders, if you're not trusting in your fellow citizens, you are less likely to contribute to getting things done. An example of this might be a trusting community might decide to build a new community center, trusting that everybody within the community is going to help in the effort, help in the cost, share in the benefits, and volunteer. But if slowly people start to pull back, saying, well, I don't trust the leadership there, I don't like the direction of this community center, you're not going to have a community center. So again, this gets into the concept of a collective action dilemma. Robert Putnam has written several books about this, Making Democracy Work, Bowling Alone. He also points to the decline of uh, organizations and public uh, activities, or joining clubs and other things like that. So people are more likely or less likely these days to be involved in the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, or scouting, or other clubs and activities, fraternal orders that maybe some of your grandparents and great grandparents were involved with, like the Elks Lodge or the Rotary, or things like this. The book name here, Bowling Alone, refers to the fact that people are less likely to join in bowling leagues than they once were. And you might say to yourself, well, what does that have to do with political trust? Well, knowing your neighbors, seeing that, the people around you are people not so different from you, that your kids are going to the same school, that you're involved in the same bowling league, that you go to the same church. Those are some things that help to build social trust in your community and make it easier for you to get things done politically. And because of this decline in association and that people are not joining organizations like these to the same extent, and the fact that people are more mobile than they used to be. Now, people like me will be born in one part of the country and then they move to Minnesota, or people are born in Minnesota and they move somewhere else. So we see people much more fluid. They probably don't live in the town that they're born in, less likely to join the organizations and to be active in the community. And for all these reasons and others too, we're seeing a decline in social capital. We're seeing a decline in political trust. But to get big things done, we need to reverse those declines. And that can be difficult, particularly when you feel that your leadership does not merit that trust, or that your neighborhood or your community or your neighbors themselves do not merit that trust. Another interesting concept explored in your reading is the concept of a clash of civilizations. Are our problems today less about a clash of states within the international system and more about um, fundamental conflict that exists between different civilizations. May those be people of Hindu background or Islamic background, Western backgrounds. So spend some time with this concept. It is problematic in the sense that it starts to speak about conflict between groups of people as being inevitable, and obviously that can be problematic. Also, it tends to discount how much discord and conflict that we have within groups, right? So the Christian world is not one of harmony, right? There's a great deal of conflict between different segments of the Christian faith. Likewise, in the Islamic world, there's a great deal of conflict between those of Sunni background or Shia background, and so on. So this concept can lead to some oversimplifications. At the same time, the Clash of Civilization framework does give us some ideas for why we see some of the conflicts that we do. Why does Russia, for example, consistently side with those groups that share its political culture and its cultural identity? Um, and we do tend to see a pattern there. So, like with so many things in the study of political science, it should be considered critically. There might be some opportunities to shed some light on conflicts in the world today, but we also need to recognize the limitations of the Clash of Civilizations approach, and also understand that it can lead to stereotyping and seeing certain forms of conflict as inevitable. Okay, let's wrap up with a few words on political culture in authoritarian states. Um, Russia is a great example of a society that has a pretty clear political culture that is sort of in direct opposition to democratic advancement. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, early 1990s, there was an idea around the world, particularly in the West, that Russia was going to evolve into some form of a democracy, beginning under the corruption of the Yeltsin regime, and then certainly under Vladimir Putin, though we saw a big return to authoritarian systems and authoritarian government. And, you know, Russia is a country that has no living memory of democratic systems and is a country that has very low levels of trust in leadership and in government, low levels of trust in fellow citizens, and a high demand for security and order, and seeking these things perhaps in their leadership. So it makes sense that somebody like Vladimir Putin would rise to power in an authoritarian political culture like you see in Russia. Um, so it's an interesting thing. Like sometimes we want to look at a leader and we say, well, Vladimir Putin created the conditions in Russia. Or was it the political culture of Russia created the conditions for the rise of Vladimir Putin? Could be some combination of the two as well. In many non democratic Islamic countries, the authoritarian rulers will kind of cherry pick. They'll draw on certain aspects of Islamic culture in a way that supports their hold on power. So, drawing on the fact that there isn't a separation between church and state, and propping up their own non-democratic government in sort of religious terms. Related to that is that what you see in many places in the world, particularly in Asia and Eastern Europe and other places where you see an authoritarian political culture. The leaders will express their acceptance of authoritarian leadership as being opposed to Western liberalism, almost like established democracies are an American idea or a Western idea, and something that these Western countries are trying to impose on us as perhaps an Islamic state, or as perhaps, if you take a look at China, a communist and Confucius state. These are ideas that are in opposition to Chinese political culture. So kind of batting away the idea of human rights or democratic advancement as being more of an American or a Western concept. And there is the challenge, too, faced by political scientists and others who are trying to figure out indigenous political values around the world because it's hard to tell how much of the political culture is indigenous to Africa or to South America or other places that there was a strong grip of colonial colonial rule. How much of the political culture is just simply opposed to colonialism, or how much of it has to do with more indigenous political values? And like with all these things, it's probably some combination. All right, well, let's sum up here. This idea of political culture, it's important, especially when it comes to comparison, to get an idea of what's happening around the world, how people feel about government, how they feel about their fellow citizens and their leaders. And there's a great deal of variation about this. But there are problems, right? Cultures are not fully held within any particular state. And there's dangers of stereotyping. Americans are like this, or the Chinese are like that, when these are large and diverse societies, right? And so, from an American perspective, many of us would see how different the political culture is between Texas and Minnesota, for example. Civic culture, identity politics, political trust, these are all important concepts to identify those attitudes that are most supportive of stable liberal democracy. We've seen a shift to post-materialism following World War II and the rise of the baby boomers to understand how political culture changes. But remember, political cultures are slow to change overall. There are exceptions, as we see with post-materialism, but because we adopt the culture that we're raised with, we're socialized as young people, and we, in many cases, adopt political attitudes that relate to our early experiences, political culture tends to be overall pretty slow to change. Political trust has been declining in democracies around the world, and for different reasons. In the United States, we saw this decline initially during the Vietnam War and the scandals of the Nixon administration. Um, and that trust, particularly in the federal government of the United States, has never fully returned. So political trust is that it's a precious commodity. Once it's lost, it can be very difficult for our leaders to regain it. We have to consider this idea of conflict between civilizations as a component of what we see in the world today. That there are some cultural allegiances that we see in um, the West and European states like the United States, that is a European settler society, or places like Australia, and some fundamental differences in the political culture that you would see relative to Asian civilizations or those in the Middle East um, uh, and in the Muslim world. At the same time, we don't want to over stereotype here. There are divisions within these civilizations. And there's a lot of examples where countries from different civilizations form enduring partnerships. So, this can be part of the discussion, but we don't want to oversimplify this concept. And then we also explored too the evidence um, that we see for an authoritarian political culture and what aspects of a political culture will support the rise of authoritarian regimes. And Russia is a great example of that. That despite the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, it did not mean that they were going to necessarily transition to a liberal democratic state. In fact, their political history, their political culture made that a pretty unlikely scenario. And here are your guiding questions for the week. Again, one substantial original post and at least two responses to your classmates. Finish strong. We have just, about a little over a month left in the class. So finish strong on your participation. Do reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns, and have a fantastic week.